Canonicity. This picture is cool. It is what's considered the oldest copy of part of the New Testament that's in existence. It's in the Rylands Library. It's papyrus number 52. It has a portion of John chapter 18 on the front and the back. It's so old that it could be, possibly, because John was one of the later books written, it could be a copy of the original book, the original writing, or it could be a copy of a copy. It's pretty early. It's the earliest piece of the New Testament that we have. Remember, there's two kinds of authority in the church. Irenaeus said this, right? He said, we have the oral tradition, the rule of faith that's passed down by the bishops and the presbyters, the church leadership, and they received it from the apostles. And so in all the churches, it's passed on generation after generation. They also have, and Irenaeus uses this too, right? The written scriptures, the written word of God. And that too is preserved, like that little piece of papyrus. These people had copies of New Testament books, Old Testament as well, that they preserved and passed on for use in the churches, in the congregations. So how did the written word come to be accepted as the Word of God? This process is called canonization. That's what we're talking about. The inspired books are inspired by God first, and then the people of God read it, hear it, and say, yes, this is inspired. It's recognized. And when that happens, canonization has taken place. The books have canonicity. The New Testament, differently from the Old Testament, was written across a much larger geographic area because the church expanded so fast. Even in the times of the New Testament, right? It's already going to Rome and beyond, perhaps. Paul might have gone to Spain. So these this expansion, right? It's covering such a large area, and the writers of the New Testament are writing from different areas. Some say that John, the tradition is, wrote most of his books from Ephesus in Turkey. Matthew wrote his book, his gospel, probably in Israel because it was more geared toward Jews. And then Mark might have written with Peter, or under Peter's supervision at least, in Rome. Paul wrote from lots of different places. So all of these books come from different places and different times. This means that it took some time for these books to be spread around and for all Christians everywhere to say, okay, here's all the books that were inspired in the New Testament. It's not a conspiracy. A lot of textbooks nowadays, a lot of websites, a lot of people will say that it is some kind of conspiracy, that it took so long because all of a sudden people later said, oh, we need books that make us the powerful ones. And so in that say what we believe, right? And so they cut out all these other ones that could have gone into the New Testament. That's not true. They had certain principles that they used, and those principles accepted, with those principles, they accepted these 27 books. And the others, the Gnostic Gospels, right, which we've already mentioned, that were written much later by total randos, were not accepted. Okay? Here is an interesting fact, too. This doesn't mean that, because every branch of Christianity accepts it, it must be true. But it's kind of interesting and cool at the same time. All branches of Christianity, Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, we'll talk about them later, Roman Catholics, Protestants, accept the new 27 books of the New Testament. You could even say that certain cultists, like the Mormons, they accept the 27 book New Testament. Now they've added on another testament, right? The Book of Mormon. But even they accept the original New Testament is the New Testament. 27 books. Here's the principles that they used, okay? The people back in this time, these are the things that they looked at. And they're the same things that we can use to look at the books today, okay? They made their decision back then. We can agree with their decision, not just because, oh, they said so, but because we can look at some of the same things they were looking at. It's another reason that church history is so important. Authoritative. Does it claim to be from God? Now, this might not be explicit, like some of the Old Testament prophets said, "Thus saith the Lord." But when it came as something that wasn't just some nice thoughts, but it said, "Do this. This is from God." It carries that extra weight. The most important principle, though, is the second one, prophetic. Is it written by one of God's spokesmen? Remember, Deuteronomy talks about this, right? In the Old Testament. This is how it lays out rules that God's people can use to determine whether a prophet was a true prophet of God or a false one. The same thing applies to the New Testament in the case of the apostles. These are people that saw Jesus alive and were accredited by him through lots of miracles, through speaking, teaching, right? That they are God's spokesmen. Is it authentic? That is, has no factual errors, right? It's not suddenly telling us some fancy new doctrine that was never even hinted at in previous revelation, right? That contradicts, more importantly, something that has been said before. Is it dynamic? That is, does it have the power, which all true words of God do, right? To transform lives. And was it received? This is the second most important thing, right? Was it received by the original audience as from God? So, for instance, John, right? Supposedly, and I think it's very likely, that he wrote most of his works in Ephesus, except Revelation, right? He wrote it in Patmos. But in Ephesus, let's say, there's a church, and that church lasts for generations, and it did. So let's say 200 years later, there's a Roman Christian, and he's just received the book of John. I don't think it took this long. It took a lot less time for them to be reading the book of John than 200 years. But let's say several years later, right, a Roman Christian gets this book that supposedly is from John. What can he do? Well, he can look to see, is it written? It claims to be by John, by a disciple of the Lord, right? Then he can see, okay, he can go to Ephesus, or he can send someone. He can ask, write a letter, say, hey, church, Christians in Ephesus, is this from John? And they, on the other hand, right, this is where this comes in handy, having the oral tradition, right, passed down through their church leaders, they can say, yeah, when John was here, he wrote this gospel, and it's good. It's the word of God for you. So now Christians in Rome can say, okay, all right, great, we're going to use it. Same goes for the writings of Paul, Peter, the rest of them. The oral tradition helps solidify the written scriptures. Now, the connection between these two, by the way, I want you to think about a little more. I'm going to ask you a question for homework. But for now, that is canonicity.